G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Acts. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you. Okay, so into the book of Acts. This week we're in Acts chapter 27, verse 27 to 28:10. We're drawing towards the end of the book. In our last week, we saw King Agrippa and the chief men conclude that Paul, there was no charge for him to answer to, but fortunately, Paul has appealed to Caesar, so he needs to go to Caesar. He's no longer under their jurisdiction, so he has to go to Caesar. So Paul, along with some other prisoners, are handed over to Julius, who's a Roman centurion, and Luke and Aristarchus now accompany Paul on his way to Rome. They're using a small coastal trading ship, and they'll change ships at Myra, where they get onto a grain ship, which is heading to Italy. Grain ship's much bigger, heading off to Italy. On the trip, the winds were against them, so it was a pretty slow trip. And finally, they get to a place called Fairhaven, which is Good Harbor, and it's just on the south side of the island of Crete. They spent some time there waiting for better weather, and finally, they decide to head off. However, Paul gives them a warning there. He says, listen, he says, don't leave, because you're going to suffer damage if you leave here. You know, you're going to take loss. However, you know, who's Paul? He's not a sea captain. He's not the owner of the vessel, but he's a man who's had lots of experience with shipwrecks and bad weather, so he should know. However, they take no notice of him. Now, the weather was against them, as it was not the sailing season. Remember, we spoke about the sailing season. This is not the sailing season. This is the winter months. And what happens now, we have a tempest, or we have a typhoon. A typhoon now grips a hold of the ship, and they lose control of the ship. And now the ship is simply being driven along by the wind, by the typhoon. They managed to find a little shelter in a place called Cordia. And what they did there was they managed to drag their dinghy on board and also wrap some ropes around the hull of the ship to hold it together, because there's a danger that it will split apart in this strong storm. And just after they've done that, they're back out into the weather, and they're now throwing things overboard to try and lighten the ship. And in this time, they hadn't seen sun or moon for many days, and they're now actually lost hope of life. That they all figured this is it. We're not going to see this one out. Paul tells them, however, he said, "Listen, you guys should have listened to me, not in a boasting way. Just says, listen, you should have listened to what I said." Now Paul gives them a little bit of good news, because he says there's not going to be any loss of life. Only the ship. And the reason for this was that an angel appeared to him and told him so. And so the angel says, you know, you and all the members of this ship will be safe. The reason he's going to be saved is because he has to appear before Caesar. And God has granted the lives of all those on board to Paul as a gift, as a charis gift. Bad news is that they're going to be shipwrecked in an island, and that island, we'll find out today, will be Malta. And Malta is about 476 miles off course. So that's how far this typhoon has blown them off course. Okay, so we now come to the shipwreck. And we see this in verses 27 to 44 of chapter 27. And now they're in an area called the Sea of Adria. It says, when the 14th night was come, as we were driven to and fro in the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors surmised that they were drawing near to some country. So 14 days, they found themselves in this Sea of Adria. Now, the timing was on the 14th night. So they've been blown around for 2 whole weeks. 2 whole weeks. And what we see here is they're driven to and fro by the wind. And the place where they were driven to and fro was the Sea of Adria. Now, this is not the Adriatic Sea. This is south of the Adriatic Sea. This is what is the Gulf of Adria, which is it's the central portion of the Mediterranean Sea. It's between Greece and Italy, and it extends down south to Crete and to Malta. Now, at this point, they begin sensing that there's land, and it was about midnight. So the sailors surmised here they were coming near to a country. They got no idea where they are. And the Greek word surmised means that they began to suspect. So they suspected that they were nearing land, even though it was at midnight. And this was due to their experience as sailors. They probably heard the sound of breakers crashing on the reef or on seashore or something like that. And that usually means that there's a landmass nearby. And now this begins to make him a little bit nervous. And in verse 28, we see that they began to take some soundings. You know, they drop a weight over the ship and with a rope and see when it doesn't drop anymore. And that's how they take soundings of how deep the water is. It says, and they sounded, verse 28, and they sounded and they found 20 fathoms. And after a little space, they sounded again and found 15 fathoms. So the first sounding, first depth of water they found was 20 fathoms. And a fathom is 6 feet, so it's 120 feet deep. I still talk in feet. And at that point, the sea was 120 feet deep. And after a short time, another sounding, it's now 90 feet deep. So we're getting closer to a land somewhere. And at that point in verse 29, we now have the dropping of the anchors. And fearing lest haply we should be cast ashore on rocky ground, they let go 4 anchors from the stern and wished for the day. Now, the reason for the dropping of the anchors was that they feared that the ship would be driven onto the rocky banks, rocky sides of the island, or wherever they are. And so they dropped these anchors over the stern of the ship, and they're for them. The Greek word here for rocky means rough. It means what the Greeks literally says here, lest we should fall down against rocky places. That's how the Greek reads. Now, dropping the anchors was to bring the ship to a halt. They want to try and stop the ship from moving any closer to the land, so they wouldn't hit the rocks. So we now have, they're in a position where they can drop an anchor and the anchor will find the ground. So this way they stopped the ship, and they wished for day. Why? Because they were able to see where they are. And in the daylight, they'd know which direction they need to head. So literally, the word wished means that they prayed. And that's what the word wished means in Greek. They prayed. And it says they kept on praying for the day to come. And most likely, this refers to believers in the group who were the ones who were doing the praying. Pagans may have prayed to their gods as well, but it's the believers who are in the group whose prayers will be answered. Now, in verse 30, we now have there's a plot from the sailors on board. And as the sailors were seeking to flee out of the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the color as though they would lay out anchors from the foreship. So the plan was, as the sailors were seeking to flee out of the ship, the sailors are trying to save themselves at the expense of others. The captain never leaves. He's the last to leave the sinking ship, but the sailors are the first in this instance. And the act being, they had lowered the boat, which is this was the same little dugout dinghy that they had drawn on board during the storm and lashed it on board. They're now trying to use this dinghy to save themselves and abandon the other passengers, the other members of the crew. However, they had to do this under deception. They were acting as though they were going to again release some more anchors. So it was under pretense. It was a pretext. So this is at the front of the ship. So they pretended that they needed the dinghy to lay at the anchors in the front. However, Paul knew what they were actually doing. And in verse 31, we have Paul's warning. He says, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, he said, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. So Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers that unless these sailors remained in the ship, everybody would be lost. The sailors were needed to properly beach the ship when the land comes. And this is a good example here that God not only ordains the end, but he also ordains the means. You remember God had ordained the saving of their lives, and that's the end game. And he also ordained the means, and that was these particular sailors. These were the only guys who knew how to sail this ship to get it grounded on the beach. Now, by this time, the centurion had learned to respect Paul. And he was more careful now to listen to him at this time rather than what he did the previous time, where he says, took no notice of Paul. And we have in verse 32, we have then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And so what we see here is they allowed this little dinghy to fall away and to disappear. It was totally out of the picture now. No chance of anyone hopping into this dinghy. And in verses 33 to 34, we now have Paul's admonition here. And while the day was coming, Paul besought them all to take some food, saying, this day is the 14th day that you wait and continue fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I beseech you to take some food, for this is for your safety. For there shall not a hair perish from the head of any of you. So as daylight was coming on, it was about to dawn, Paul says to them, listen, he besought them, he kept on telling him, he kept on being at them, that you need to take some food. This was the 14th day. They've had a 14-day fast, a compulsory fast, because we're pretty busy with the weather. And so this is the 14th day since they'd eaten. And so, he says, listen, it's time for you guys to eat. And the reason was, they needed to eat for their safety. And the Greek word for safety here is the normal Greek word for salvation. Now remember, the Greek word for salvation is not only used for spiritual salvation, but it also used for physical salvation. And that's the way it's being used in this context. It's for your physical salvation. And the promise here is that not a hair from any of them shall perish. And this phrase, that not a hair shall perish, was actually a proverbial expression for physical salvation. Not a hair of your head will be lost. And once again, what we see here is that God has ordained the end, which is their physical salvation, and also the means, which is their eating. So again, we see this here. And then in verse 35, to encourage them, we see Paul's example. When he had said this and had taken bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. So this verse gives us Paul's example to encourage the others to do the same thing. And when he had spoken the words of 33 to 34, he now gave thanks to God in the presence of all. He said grace, which would have been done loudly and publicly. And this is a typical a Jewish blessing from Milos. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Amen. That's what his grace blessing would have contained. And the Greek word for giving thanks here is grace, and it's the word from which we get our English word Eucharist. So this is the source of the English word Eucharist. And in keeping with the traditional Jewish manner of eating, he gave thanks first, then he broke the bread. And he did this in the presence of everybody to encourage them. So he began to eat, and then we see the response of the others. He says, oh, well, this guy's eating. He seems to have a direct line to God, and he's eating now. So if it's okay for him, maybe we'll continue to eat as well. And in verse 36, we see the response. It says, then were they all of good cheer, and themselves also took food. They're probably happy that there's a man of God on board and he's giving them some good information. And they're probably pretty happy now, you know. So the response here was twofold. First of all, they became cheerful. They were happy. Paul encouraged them to be cheerful. And secondly, they all took food following Paul's example. So they were cheerful and their appetites returned. So see, people are always watching us, what we do. So we need to be cheerful and do things so that they can take example. In verse 37, we have the number of people on this ship. You know, you'd have thought, oh, well, you know, it's just a coastal ship, but in actual fact, and we were all in the ship 216 souls. So 276 people were on this ship. And all of these people were promised physical salvation, physical survival. And again, see here where Luke's writing and he says, we were all, so again, you know, Luke's writing from his perspective here. In verse 38, we now see they throw some more cargo overboard. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So when they had eaten, they regained some more strength. And when it says eaten enough, it means to satisfy or to satiate their hunger. They were then able, and the Greek text literally says, having been satiated with food, they were then able to act in that they lightened the ship. So they began making the ship lighter. The means was by throwing out the wheat into the sea. So all the wheat that had not been thrown out earlier, they probably wanted to keep some wheat on board in case they actually made it back to Italy, was now thrown out. And the purpose was to let the ship float higher in the water. And that would allow her to run as far up the beach as possible before being grounded. So that's their plan. And in verse 39, we have them sighting the land. It says, when it was day, they knew not the land, but they perceived a certain bay with a beach, and they took counsel whether they could drive the ship upon it. Now, because they're so far off course, you know, they're 476 miles away from where they should be, they didn't recognize the identity of the landmass down here. No one would have known that they were driven over 400 miles off course. Later, they're going to discover that this place is Malta. They tried to recognize it, but they simply couldn't recognize it. What they did see was they saw a certain bay with a sandy beach, and they gradually perceived with some effort that it was a bay, and it says here that they took counsel. So, you know, it was a deliberation with some concern at the same time. You know, what's our plan? What are we going to do? And what they ended up deciding was that they decided to sacrifice the ship by running it aground. So the storm, remember, the storm is still blowing a tempest out there, and they're still in this storm, but they're now a little bit sheltered by the island. And so they decide, we're going to drive this ship onto the beach. They're going to try and drive it up as far at the beach as possible. The closer they can drive the ship toward the beach was the less distance they'd have to swim to shore in this awful waves and stuff. So they need to try and drive it as far up as they can. And then we see in verse 40, casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea. At the same time, loosing the bands of the rudders and hoisting up the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. So the attempt to make the beach we see in 4 steps. First of all, they cast off the anchors. They were the 4 anchors that they had put out before to hold their ship in that position. So they disconnected the anchors, the ship from the anchors, and they allowed the anchors to disappear. Ropes fell into the sea. They're not going to need them anymore anyway, because the ship's going to be destroyed, so they don't need the anchors anymore. And second, what they did was at the same time, they loosed the bands off the rudders. Now, ancient ships like this one had a pair of paddle rudders at the back, and these had to be fastened while the ship was anchored, otherwise they just flop around in the current. And now the anchors here were now loose. The anchors were loosed, and now the rudders were loosed. And the third thing they did was they hoisted up the foresail to the wind. And this is a small sail. It's in the bow of the ship that was primarily used for guiding the ship. And the purpose of this was to pick up speed so that the ship would be grounded as far as possible up the beach. And the fourth thing they did was they made for the beach. What they did was they held the ship. They were aiming for the beach. They said, "That's the spot we want to beach it. Let's go for that spot." And then in verse 41, it was not quite where they desired to go, but lighting upon a place where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground. And the four ships stuck and remained unmovable, but the stern began to break up by the violence of the waves. The place where two seas met. What we have here is that there was a reef where two seas met. This is between two cross currents, is virtually what it is. It was probably a channel with deeper water on each side of it. And the Greek word here for lighting upon means to fall into, and so to be encompassed or surrounded by. So that's what we see here. It's they were surrounded by, or they were encompassed by this place where these two seas met. So what we see here now is that they ran the vessel aground, not on the shore as I hoped, but on a shoal. What happened was the ship now strikes a sandbar. The problem was that the ship hitting this sandbar was now stuck, and it remained unmovable. It was stuck there. It was fixed firmly, according to the Greek. So the front of the ship was stuck in this sandbar and it couldn't move. The back or the stern of the ship was being wrenched at an angle to the bow, and the ship was now being broken up by the violence of the waves. So the front part stuck unmovable, the back part was being pounded away by the waves and the surf, and the ship was beginning to break apart beneath them because of these waves. In verse 42, at this point, the soldiers, we had the sailors before with their ideas, now the soldiers come up with an idea. The soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. So the idea by the soldiers was to kill all the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. And the Greek means to swim out or to escape, means it's a total escape, means to completely escape from the soldiers, be free again. Not just from the shipwreck, but from the soldiers themselves. Now, Roman law held guards personally responsible for their charges, and those who allowed prisoners to escape could pay with their own lives. So we saw this twice earlier. We saw it back in Acts chapter 12, verse 19, and then in Acts chapter 16, verse 27. So if these soldiers lost the prisoners, they could be executed. So they figured, well, rather than taking the chance of losing a prisoner, let's just kill all the prisoners now. And in verse 43, we have now the centurion. He sort of steps in now. He says, but the centurion, desiring to save Paul, stayed them from their purpose. Now, Luke here explained that the centurion was primarily concerned with preserving Paul's life. So once again, what we see here, it's a Roman official who intervened to save the life of the Apostle Paul. He had obviously grown to trust Paul, and the act was that he stayed the soldiers in their purpose, and in that sense, he's now risking his own life, because if anyone escaped, then it would be the centurion who would be executed. So he's He's really putting his life on the line to save Paul. But he's obviously heeding what Paul's message to them was that not a life will be lost. Everybody will be saved. So he's taking note of what Paul has been saying. And then we have the centurion's command, and he commanded that they who could swim should cast themselves overboard and get first to the land, and the rest, some on planks, some on other things from the ship. So the centurion's command was twofold. First of all, if you can swim, hop over and go for it. Jump overboard, swim to the beach. It says swim to the land, it means just get there. Get to the beach. Those who could swim, they're on their own. Second, for those who could not swim, they were told to go on planks or other pieces of the ship, because the ship's now breaking up. And it's so go on the boards, any boards which have come loose from the ship, hang on to them. They're to try to make it on their own to the land. And the result we see in the second part of verse 44 is, so it came to pass that they all escaped safe to the land. So the result was that they all escaped to the land. They all made it alive. So Paul's prophecy of verses 22 and verse 34 now fulfilled, come to pass. Now we get to this little place called Melita, or what we know as Malta. And we see the time that they had in Malta. You see verses 1 to 6, we see there's a little snake incident here. It says, and when we were escaped, then we knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarians showed us no common kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us all because of the present rain and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out by reason of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous creature hanging from his hand, they said one to another, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he had escaped from the sea, yet justice had not suffered to live. Howbeit he shook off the creature into the fire and took no harm. But they expected that he would have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But when they were long in expectation and beheld nothing amiss came to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So we have the identity of the island. When they were escaped, when all made it to the shore, they realized this island is called Melita. Melita is known as Malta today. It's around about 100 kilometers south of Sicily. It's about 30 kilometers long. It's just not a very big island. Melita is a Phoenician name, and it means escape or refuge. Why did they name it that? Because it was a haven or an escape for early Phoenician sailors from the weather. Later on, the island was the name was Hellenized to Malta. We have the reception they received. It says the barbarians showed us no common kindness. Now, the word barbarians here, it doesn't mean what we think it means. It does not mean the same in the classical Greek as what it means today. Today it refers to someone who is uneducated or dumb or a savage. But in that day, it simply referred to anyone who did not speak Greek or Latin. They were cultured natives, but they did not speak Greek or Latin. Remember, the Roman soldiers would have spoken Latin as well as Greek. The term barbarian simply means that it's a people who spoke a foreign language. And in this case, they spoke a Phoenician dialect. And we see it in the book of Acts. It's used twice, this term barbarians. It's used here in verse 2 and again in verse 4. Outside of Acts 28, it's used by Paul in 3 places. We see it in Romans chapter 1, verse 14, in 1 Corinthians 14:11, and also in Colossians chapter 3, verse 11, where Paul refers to somebody as a barbarian. The word that we see showed here it means that they kept on showing. So these Maltese, if you like, they kept on showing. What did they keep on showing? They kept on showing this common kindness. And the word for common kindness that we see here is in the Greek is where we get our word philanthropic from. It means these Maltese had a real love of mankind, if you like. They were very philanthropic towards these 276 people. By saying no common kindness, it means that these Maltese showed kindness which was beyond your common courtesy. They went right beyond that. They went out of their way to show kindness to these shipwrecked people. And the means of their kindness was twofold. First of all, they kindled a fire. They got some burning, they started fire some burning sticks. So they made this fire from the burning sticks, and then they showed kindness above the norm by receiving them all. Literally, it says they took us all to themselves. They took protective care of these shipwrecked people. They did this for two reasons. First of all, because of the present rain, because it was still pelting down. The Greek literally says, because of the rain that stood upon them, the rain was belting down. And second, because of the cold. Remember, there's still a storm going on, the wind and the rain, and it's also time is about, it's late autumn, early winter, so it's bitterly cold, and the fire would have warmed them up here. Now, after all that, imagine after all that Paul had done for the passengers and the crew, and following such a huge ordeal as this, being shipwrecked again, you might have expected Paul to, have sat back and just had a little breather. After all, Paul was around about 54 at this time, so he wasn't that young. Instead, what he got stuck into it as well, and he did his share of the work, and he helped gather fuel for the fire. And in verse 3, we see that this viper coming into the picture now, because it says, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks, and the Greek word for gathered here is to twist or to turn together in a bundle. Paul grabbed a bundle of sticks for the fire, and he laid them upon the fire. And at that point, boom, a bite happens. A viper came out by reason of the fire. So a viper or a snake came out because of the heat. Remember, it's cold, and these are reptiles. So this viper was stiff from the cold. He was easily mistaken for just another stick, and he was picked up in the bundle by Paul. And now the heat revived him, stirred him up, and in typical viper fashion, if you're in the fire, you strike out. And then this guy struck out, and he bit Paul's hand and fastened itself to his hand. So Paul has this viper hanging off his hand. The Greek word means to fasten down on his hand. So Paul is standing there with this viper dangling from his hand. And what happened now is that the natives saw what happened, and eventually they came up with two conclusions of their own. First of all, these barbarians or these natives believed that Paul was a murderer. Why? Well, obviously he's a murderer. Look, a snake's just bit him. That's your evidence for being a murderer. And when the barbarians saw the venomous creature hanging from his hand, this is what they say. The Greek for this venomous creature, it means a little beast. Aristotle and Greek medical writers of that period used the same term for venomous serpents, especially vipers. So the term that's being used here is of a poisonous snake. And the snake had sunk his fangs into Paul's hand, was dangling by its teeth or its fangs from Paul's hand. So these natives say to one another, listen, they said one to another, no doubt this man is a murderer. So they believed that he was actually a murderer. These guys are like Job's comforters. The mentality that says that if something bad like that happens to you, it must be because you're a sinner. And So that's what these guys are saying. You've been bitten by this venomous snake because you must have done something really bad. That's what Job's friends said. And that's what lots of people say to us today. Oh, geez, you must be done something really bad to, have that dealt out to you. Now, so the natives here, they reckon that Paul must be a murderer. So divine retribution has finally caught up to him. So they believe that even though he escaped from the sea, justice did not allow him to live. Now you see justice, you see in your Bibles, it's got a capital J because it is the justice in the Greek. It's the justice. It's a reference to either a God or justice personified. So these guys expected Paul to die because of the bite. They believed that such a calamity took place because Paul was a murderer, and these people thought that that calamity was proof of guilt. So what we see here is very, very poor philosophy and in fact worse theology. Now Luke used the word dike, D-I-K-E, to describe justice. Now dike, D-I-K-E, was a name of the Greek goddess of justice who was responsible for meting out justice to the guilty. It's unlikely that the Maltese barbarians venerated the Greek goddess Dike, but it's likely that they had a similar concept in their own religion. That's why Luke translated it into the Greek equivalent. In verse 5, Paul shakes the creature. He shook it off his hand and it fell into the fire, and it says he took no harm. In other words, nothing happened to Paul. Snake bite had no snake bite effect upon him. So justice was not catching up with Paul. Quite the contrary. What we see here was providence. God's providence was preserving Paul. And second, they wrongly concluded that he was a god. So he's gone from being a murderer. Oh, well, he didn't die, so he must be a god then. And the background to their conclusion is that they expected something to occur, and they kept on expecting one of two things to occur. First of all, he should have swollen up. Literally, they expected him to be about to swell up. This is a common medical term. Again, this Luke writing, so he's using medical terms here. In Greek, it means to burn or to inflame or to cause to swell. And second, he should have fallen down dead suddenly. So they expected him to suddenly fall down dead. So that was the background of what they expected. And Luke points out the reason for their second conclusion. But when they were long in expectation and beheld nothing amiss, nothing happened to him. Literally, while they were expecting for much of the time, nothing happened to Paul. Nothing out of place happened to him. So they then had to reach another conclusion. That is, okay, well, he's not a murderer, so therefore he must be a god. And two things took place. First of all, they changed their minds. And it means, the Greek means to turn around, to turn themselves about. They decided, no, he's not a murderer, so let's go the opposite way. This means a change of mind. So they changed their minds there and they said, well, he's not a murderer, therefore he must be a god. Simply because, well, he's not dead. He's not a fugitive at all, but he's actually a god. Another faulty assumption. Because he sustained the bite of a poisonous snake, it meant he must be a god. No. Paul was thoroughly under the protection of God here. Whether a storm at sea or a viper in land, Paul was delivered against all expectations. Both of these were acts of divine providence. Both were miraculous. Now, God did not allow Paul to die because he had a different plan for him. Now, this is the second time in the book of Acts that Paul was taken to be a god. The first time was back in Acts 14, verse 11 to 12. Now we come to Publius and his father, verse 7 to 10 of chapter 28. In the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us 3 days courteously. And it was so that the father of Publius lay sick of fever and dysentery, unto whom Paul entered in and prayed, and laying his hands on him, healed him. And when this was done, the rest also that had diseases in the island came and were cured, who also honored us with many honors. And when we sailed, They put on board such things as we needed. So we see the reception now that Publius gives them. We see the lands in this area were belonged to the chief man of the island named Publius. The Greek reading says it's the first man of the island. Now, this is not a description, but this is actually an official title for the leader of Malta. In fact, archaeologists have found other previous leaders of the island. One was named Prudence. He's called the primate of the Maltese, or the first man of Malta. So this is what Luke is writing about. So Malta was part of the province of Sicily, which was 60 miles away. Sicily was ruled by a propraetor. The chief man of Malta was this propraetor's immediate subordinate. So Luke's title is the correct title for the island of Malta, which shows his clear accuracy in how he records history. So this guy is Publius. It's a Greek name. And Publius received us, and this includes Luke, and entertained us 3 days courteously. The word courteously here means a friendly mind in a kindly manner. So in a kindly matter. So what we see here, this was probably as a result of after the incident with the snake bite. So they remained there for 3 days, well, probably till they found some proper winter lodgings could be obtained for these guys. In verse 8, we now have the healing of Publius's father, and it was so. The father of Publius lay sick of fever and dysentery. Now, this type of illness is well known in the island of Malta. In fact, it's technically called the Maltese fever, and it was caused by an organism in the goat's milk on the island of Malta. We see here that in the Greek, the word fever is in the plural. It's also a medical term for intermittent attacks of fever, which is what the father of Publius is experiencing. The Greek word for dysentery is the origin of your English word for dysentery. So this is a problem. He was having intermittent fevers and he had dysentery, 2 symptoms. He had the fever attacks and second, suffered from dysentery. Then came the cure. Paul entered into the sick room where he lay. He prayed for God to do the healing. Paul laid his hands upon him using his own gift of healing. And now, this is the only time in Acts that we see when both prayer and the laying on of hands accompany a healing. Only time. And notice here that only the apostle Paul healed him. Only apostles or their legates performed miraculous healings in the book of Acts. And the Greek word, something else here, the Greek word that we see here for healing is eamai. I think that's what it is. It's going to be different from the word for healing, which we're going to see in the next verse. And this word here, eamai, it emphasizes instantaneous miraculous healing. Now, what's the next word say? In verse 9, what we see here is the effect of the healing miracle. There was a cause and effect relationship here. And when this was done, the rest also that had diseases in the island came. And the Greek means here that they kept on coming. They kept on coming for the entire 3-month period while the party was on the island of Malta, and they were cured. And the Greek word for healing here is different from the one found in verse 8. It's the same word therapeuo, from which the English word therapeutic comes from. It's another medical term used by Luke the doctor, and it literally means, and they were getting cured, right? This time the emphasis was upon the gradual healing. It implies with the way that Luke writes that this time it was through Luke's medical skills. They were healed rather than instantaneously being healed as in the father of Publius. So this shows us here that healing is not performed miraculously and instantaneously at all times. Now this we see in verse 10. This led to the here now in verse 10 to the thankfulness of the natives. It says, who also honored us with many honors. Now, they honored them with many honors. The Greek word for honors here means honorariums. It's used in Greek literature as a technical term, as a payment for professional services. So Luke did give them professional services, and the plural pronoun us indicates here that Luke was involved with the caring of the people. And when we sailed, they put on board such things as we needed. So twice we find the word we, emphasizing that Luke is very much involved in the narrative here. And this was the third ship which they traveled upon since Caesarea. It took 3 ships for them to make it to Rome. And in thankfulness here, what we see here is that the natives provided what was needed for the journey to Rome. And that's where we end it for today. Okay. That is your lot for today.